What's good, class, and welcome back to another edition of Mr. Fitzgerald's biology class. Today we are diving into the cell theory. So we are inching ever so closely into actually observing cells and talking about the different types of cells. But before we do that, let's get an idea of the process that underwent hundreds of years by scientists to be able to come up with the understanding of the cell that we have today. So real quick before we dive in, remember a theory is an explanation of natural events. Remember, it's answering those questions about how or why. So it's going to give us a lot more detail about something that's happening. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind through all of this, yes, what we're talking about with the cell theory is true because it's been proven through multiple observations by multiple different scientists over hundreds of years, and we keep adding to it as we get new technology and new information. We don't throw the whole thing out, we just incorporate new information as it comes. So it is a very true statement that we're looking at. So don't get that confused with a law, which is just a short description. It's telling us a what's happening instead of a how or a why. So these are like those short relationships of what goes up must come down. All those things would be a law because they're not telling me why it's happening or how it's happening. It's just telling me a short little what's happening. So the big thing to remember is that idea that these things cannot become each other. So hopefully you've already kind of looked at the video about theory versus law and you understand that they are two separate ideas and one cannot become the other. Just because one is true does not mean it becomes the other. It's just a good law or a good theory if it's considered true. All right, so connect the dots. All right, our knowledge about cells is all put together in something we call the cell theory. Why do you think it's a cell theory instead of a cell law? All right, hopefully you wrote down that it's a cell theory because it's an explanation, that it's a body of understanding, and it's been done by multiple scientists over multiple years and has multiple observations. Where a cell law would just be a description of a cell is a cell. Really short, sweet, to the point. So our theory is going to be a lot more elaborate, a lot more descriptive. All right, create this timeline on your notes paper for today. There are five different scientists to kind of work together here that we're going to discuss. And you're actually going to watch a little video that goes into each of them. The video does start off with Anton von Leeuwenhoek. However, the first scientist in time is going to be Robert Hooke. So I'm going to start my notes with Robert Hooke, Anton von Leeuwenhoek, Schleiden Schwann, and then Rudolf Virchow at the end. So you can see that it spans a couple hundred years, going from 1665 all the way to 1855, and we're still adding to it today. So this cell theory is now over 350 years old, and we keep adding to it. Okay, so let's check out the video. Dive in.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists make a discovery, it's not always in a prescribed manner, as in only in a laboratory under strict settings with white lab coats and all sorts of neat science gizmos that go beep. In reality, the events and people involved in some of the major scientific discoveries are as weird and varied as they get. My case in point, the weird history of the cell theory. There are three parts to the cell theory. 1. All organisms are composed of one or more cells. 2. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization in organisms. And 3. All cells come from pre-existing cells. To be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring until you dig a little deeper into how the world of microscopic organisms and this theory came to be. It all started in the early 1600s in the Netherlands, where a spectacle maker named Zacharias Janssen is said to have come up with the first compound microscope, along with the first telescope. Both claims are often disputed, as apparently he wasn't the only bored guy with a ton of glass lenses to play with at the time. Despite this, the microscope soon became a hot item that every naturalist or scientist at the time wanted to play with, making it much like the iPad of its day. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who heard about these microscope doohickeys, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. And it was a strange little contraption indeed, as it looked more like a tiny paddle the size of a sunglass lens. If he had stuck two together, it probably would have made a wicked set of sunglasses that you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings, which, when you keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much, if at all, back then, he must have had a lovely bunch of bacteria to look at. When he wrote about his discovery, he didn't call them bacteria as we know them today, but he called them animalcules because they looked like little animals to him. While Leeuwenhoek was staring at his teeth gunk, he was also sending letters to a scientific colleague in England by the name of Robert Hooke. Hooke was a guy who really loved all aspects of science, so he dabbled in a little bit of everything, including physics, chemistry, and biology. Thus it is Hooke who we can thank for the term the cell, as he was looking at a piece of cork under his microscope, and the little chambers he saw reminded him of cells, or the rooms monks slept in their monasteries. Think college dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Hooke was something of an underappreciated scientist of his day, something he brought upon himself as he made the mistake of locking horns with one of the most famous scientists ever, Sir Isaac Newton. Remember when I said Hooke dabbled in many different fields? Well, after Newton published a groundbreaking book on how planets move due to gravity, Hooke made the claim that Newton had been inspired by Hooke's work in physics. Newton, to say the least, did not like that, which sparked a tense relationship between the two that lasted even after Hooke died, as quite a bit of Hooke's research, as well as his only portrait, was misplaced due to Newton. Much of it was rediscovered, thankfully, after Newton's time, but not his portrait, as sadly no one knows what Robert Hooke looked like. Fast forward to the 1800s, where two German scientists discovered something that today we might find rather obvious, but helped tie together what we now know as the cell theory. The first scientist was Matthias Schleiden, a botanist who liked to study plants under a microscope. From his years of studying different plant species, it finally dawned on him that every single plant he had looked at were all made of cells. At the same time, on the other end of Germany was Theodor Schwann, a scientist who not only studied slides of animal cells under the microscope and got a special type of nerve cell named after him, but also invented rebreathers for firefighters and had a kickin' pair of sideburns. After studying animal cells for a while, he too came to the conclusion that all animals were made of cells. Immediately, he reached out via snail mail, as Twitter had yet to be invented, to other scientists working in the same field, and it was Schleiden who got back to him, and the two started working on the beginnings of the cell theory. A bone of contention arose between them, as for the last part of the cell theory, that cells come from pre-existing cells, Schleiden didn't exactly subscribe to that thought, as he swore cells came from free cell formation, where they just kind of spontaneously crystallized into existence. That's when another scientist, named Rudolf Virchow, stepped in with research showing that cells did come from other cells. Research that was actually, how to put it, borrowed without permission from a Jewish scientist by the name of Robert Remak, which led to two more feuding scientists. Thus, from teeth gunk to torquing off Newton, crystallization to Schwann cells, the cell theory came to be an important part of biology today. Some things we know about science today may seem boring, but how we came to know them is incredibly fascinating. So if something bores you, dig deeper. It's probably got a really weird story behind it somewhere.
So, Robert Hooke, remember with Robert Hooke, the big thing that comes out of him is the idea of the cell. He kind of looked at pieces of cork under a microscope, and he actually thought that they looked like little houses that the monks lived in a monastery, which were called cells. Most of you, when you hear that cell, you're thinking more like jail cells, but he's the one that actually gives us the word the cell. So it kind of starts off this investigation a little bit more. Anton von Leeuwenhoek is one of the individuals that comes up with a rudimentary microscope, a lot less complicated than what we have today, but it still was able to allow him to investigate very small things. And he even looked at the scrapings of his teeth, and he called what he found underneath those animalcules because they reminded him of little animals. All that nasty bacteria and other stuff that's growing in his mouth, because remember, they didn't really brush their teeth back in the 1600s too much. Then we kind of fast forward a little bit, not much happens. We get the idea of the cell, we get von Leeuwenhoek looking at the junk in his teeth, and then we end up in the 1830s with Schleiden and Schwann, and they actually make two kind of rivaling or kind of same observations, but just in different times, in different parts of the world. They were kind of writing to each other back and forth because they had similar ideas. One came up with the idea that all plants are made of cells, and the other one came up with the idea that all animals are made out of cells, kind of looking at the world around them and kind of applying this idea that Hooke had of these little cells. Now, we've grouped that together in today's idea of all living things are made of cells, because plants, animals, and even those little animalcules and bacteria that von Leeuwenhoek was looking at are still made of cells. All right? And then finally, we get to 1855 with Rudolf Virchow, and he gives us the idea that cells don't just kind of randomly pop out of nowhere. They don't just spontaneously generate, which was the common idea of how life came to be in the 1800s. He was kind of the one that set us forth on this idea that things have to come from something. So cells have to come from an existing cell. They don't just pop out of nowhere. There had to be an existing cell that probably split into another one as well. So that brings us to the absolute parts of the cell theory. So absolutely write these down. You do need to know them. All living organisms are made of one or more cells. No matter what the organism is, it could be a plant, it could be an animal, it could be a bacteria, a protist. Every living thing has at least one cell. Some have many. You and I are made of trillions of cells, but it can just be as simple as a single cell thing. This is not something I'm going to ask you yet, but just some interesting questions to think about. Single-celled organisms are called unicellular. Uni meaning one, cellular referring to cell, so they're single cell. Organisms with many cells are called multicellular, or many cells, multi meaning many there. All right? That kind of brings us down to the second part of the cell theory, that cells are the foundation or the building block of all living organisms. Remember, you have to have at least one cell to be living, and now you have to use that as the basis for everything. So you can think in us, we have trillions of cells. We organize our cells into tissues, right? And then we organize those tissues into organs, and those organs into organ systems, into organisms. So we kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger because the cell is that basic block that we're building upon, all right? The third part, and the most obvious part for us nowadays, but again, it wasn't until about 200 years ago that we understood this, that cells come from pre-existing cells. They do not spontaneously generate, they don't pop into existence. There had to be some sort of event that creates another cell overall. All right, so what you're gonna work on now is kind of putting this all together in a document that I can verify that you actually learned this. So I want you to create a one-pager on a sheet of paper, sheet of copy paper, whatever it may be. I want you to explain why we call it a cell theory, not a cell law on there. So at maybe the top or somewhere, give me a brief little statement on why we call it a cell theory instead of cell law. Rewind back in the video if you forgot, I do go over it at the beginning. Then I want you to write down the 3 parts of the cell theory, what I just went over a few seconds ago. So rewind the video if you need to stop, pause it, and write those 3 parts down. And then I want a drawing that showcases each one of those. So that way I can understand that you're getting this not only from a words perspective, but you're truly understanding it because you're able to represent it through a picture. That's all I have for today, and hope you have a good one.